My wife Betty Boop is really hot.
When I look at my husband, I get butterflies in my tummy.
I'm so lucky I'm married to Betty Boop.
I'm in love.
I've gotta tell the guys at work about this.
For much of 2020, there wasn't anything that I looked forward to more than this current new age plague that we are still dealing with, mind you, coming to an end. But as the days and then weeks and then months wore on, things were becoming a lot bleaker, and it was hard to not focus solely on the world seemingly being up in flames. Then along came one webcomic with a premise so absurd that it became a welcome distraction. That comic was Mr. Boop, a story where the main character, Alec, is married to Betty Boop. Yes, that Betty Boop. And for those of you who haven't already clicked away, I want to assure you that there is a story, or at least an analysis here, that should be interesting enough if you decide to stick around to the end of this video. But anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. And you know that I'm a real fan because I bought one of the copies of the first run of the Volume 1 prints. And check this out. It's signed. It's signed. But yeah, I'm committed to this. And actually, in doing the research and rereading the comic and the game and the videos, it actually inspired me to make my own set of comics that I'd like to call Mrs. the Stampede, a totally original take where I illustrate my life with my very real anime husband, Bash the Stampede. Don't we look so cute together in this photo? But before getting into all of that, my name is Cher, and this is my art and commentary space. If you're new here, hey, feel free to check out my other videos on this channel and see if you vibe with any of them at all. And if you're returning, hello, welcome. Always a pleasure to see you again. I hope you all enjoyed this deep dive into the themes of Mr. Boop, or at least the themes that I picked up on. There's no real confirmation on any of these. I just really like to theorize about media. And I already know this video is going to be kind of a weird one, but a fun time nonetheless, I think. And also kind of topical, since parts of this video are going to focus on love towards the end, and I'm recording this near Valentine's Day, and maybe this is just my way of trying to justify this video's existence. But anyway, let's get into it. Mr. Boop is an online webcomic started in February of 2020 by one Alec Robbins that completed its run almost a year later in January of 2021. The initial premise for the series centers on Alec's marriage to Betty Boop. Again, yes, that Betty Boop, as we get a slice of life narrative of what it's like to be married to the iconic 1930s bombshell. And here's a hint, it involves a lot more swinging than you would imagine. Now, this premise alone of an adult man not only shipping himself with a cartoon character, but then deciding to make an entire series based off of that, where the central conflict is that if he ever leaves her, he gets in the head, is okay. Yeah, I'm gonna admit it's weird on its own, even as far as self-insert fanfics go. But then you throw in the fact that his co-workers are Bugs Bunny and Peter Griffin, and that they all work in a subway, and then I don't know, but I just find that very funny and compelling, and I was just ready to submit myself to whatever little narrative journey I was being taken on. But as amusing as it was to see these classic characters interact in such absurd and out-of-character ways, had the comic been so one note, it really wouldn't be anything for me to talk about, and past the initial humor of the premise, I might not have continued reading it past the first few volumes or so. But then it keeps going, and the comic develops a surprisingly mature, at times, and thoughtful metafiction that gives a big middle finger to copyright law, and I'm honestly surprised that not many people have made videos on it. And okay, but wait, I should probably slow down and actually tell you what happens in the main story before I get all analysis heavy. So in the interest of clarity, here's a rundown of the Mr. Boop lore, with some analysis thrown in at the end of each section. Though I do still recommend you all read the comic, as well as look through the videos and the video game and Boop-related media on your own, not only because there's going to be little things here and there that I leave out, and also it's only 211 strips, so it's a fairly quick read anyway, but also because there was quite a bit of effort that Alec Robbins, the creator, put in behind the scenes that can be appreciated even for a silly little comic. So, as mentioned before, the comic starts out as a fairly slice-of-life account of Alec's life with Betty Boop, going through the relatable trials and tribulations of everyday couples like codependency, erectile dysfunction, and everyone ogling and salivating over your very hot wife, to the point that they suggest she leaves you for them, the latter of which becomes a conflict between Alec and his co-worker Bugs Bunny, the latter of whom almost attempts to kill Alec before a brief discussion between the two persuades him against doing this and switching jobs to work at Amazon where, and this must be noted, he isn't allowed pee breaks, though I'm sure the distance also helps with curbing the murderous rage. And although that situation has mostly resolved itself, Alex still frets over how it went down with Bugs. That is until the local bartender, Sonic the Hedgehog, suggests that he mend the friendship by having a ménage à trois between Alec, Betty, and Bugs. This seems to settle things, and once the word gets out, it snowballs into the couple ménage à however many other characters. So many that by the time Sonic, the person who actually suggested they do this in the first place, plucks up the courage to ask the couple, they're all ménage à trois out. You know, I'm starting to realize why not a lot of people are making videos on this comic, because it gets really hard to write and talk around all of the non-safe for work stuff that happens, and I know that YouTube doesn't like that, but anyway, Sonic doesn't take this decision well. And after falsifying divorce papers and attempting to get Alec's lawyer to kill Alec doesn't work, Sonic takes matters into his own hands and shoots Alec himself, with this act ending Volume 1. So, before moving into what happens in the next volume, I think we should take a break here and discuss self-insert fanfiction and the taboo of it in serious literary narratives, and how it relates to the comic and why it gained an audience. Self-insert fiction, or fiction that inserts the author into a pre-established narrative, is a phenomenon that actually predates modern online discourse or stigma, and has likely been a part of our human storytelling since our origins. I think one of the most well-known literary examples of self-inserts is Dante's Divine Comedy, where Dante, the author of this series, is led by a philosopher he stands to the circles of hell and eventually reunites with his waifu. And why that story has much more respectability when compared to modern examples of self-insert fic has a myriad of answers. Maybe it has to do with the politics of the time that it engaged with, or the incredibly influential depictions of hell in the modern consciousness, or any other third thing. But the point is that self-insert fics have existed since, forever. And this is also a petition to start seriously calling them self-insert fics and serious literary discussion. But where we get into a modern critique of self-inserts comes with the rise of modern fanfiction in the late 60s with the prevalence of these Star Trek fanzines, or fan-made magazines meant to be distributed within fan circles. Due to the lack of barrier of entry, anonymity, and not a strict quality control, a lot of the work in these fanzines ended up with less than stellar writing that became vehicles of playing out wish fulfillment fantasies. The style of writing had taken the notice of Star Trek fan Paula Smith, and, in 1973, she coined the term Mary Sue to describe original characters in a narrative that were seemingly perfect at everything. Smith had noticed a particular trend in the fanfic she read. The wish fulfillment original character protagonist who was perfect at everything. She could fight, she could captain her own ship, she could make both the fiery Kirk and the cold Spock fall madly in love with her. Her story was every teenage Trekkie's wet dream. In the years since, self-insert fics gained a negative stigma, and it quickly became considered a type of cringe type of storytelling that people typically abandon post-adolescence. So I find it interesting that Alec Robbins knowingly and directly engages in that cringe storytelling to tell a story. And for more about cringe or cringe culture, feel free to check out my previous video on the topic where I go more in depth about that. But going back to the comic, it presents a pretty interesting twist on the modern perception of self-insert fics. Yes, in this world he is married to his super mega hot rich wife Betty Boop, but Mary Gary Stu he is not. Actually, his in-universe self comes off as kind of a loser. Sure, he gets downtime to make these weird, silly little comics, but he clearly still relies on his wife's fortune to afford things like the house he lives in or the many therapy appointments he goes to. And when you view the premise from another angle, it's just a guy who works part-time at a Subway, who has no redeeming qualities or even interest outside of having a wife who everyone around him says is too good for him anyway. It's honestly pretty sad, but it makes for a cool inversion of the typical self-insert trope in that Alec Boop Robbins seems to have many flaws that are pointed out by other characters in the story that his own delusions prevent him from addressing. So rather than being an entirely genuine expression of wish fulfillment that we expect from self-insert fics, this main character represents a critique or parody of the genre as he comes off as kind of the butt of the joke in his own work. And that's because the comic isn't meant to be taken seriously. And this is furthered by the wink to the reader that acknowledge the absurdity of the premise, and a normal distance from these characters that reassure us that Alec Robbins, the living, breathing person, doesn't actually believe he's married to Betty Boop. Right? Alec Robbins, are you /SRS or /J? Well, let's try to answer that for ourselves as we get into the next few volumes of the comic. Volume 2 begins, and we find Alec awakened in a state somewhere between the living and the dead, and he is greeted by the celestial representation of his wife. And her appearance here shares a similarity between Vishnu and early biblical descriptions of angels, a sort of mashup. In this in-between void, Celestial Betty, which is my name for her and I'll shorten it to CB sometimes, says something interesting here that marks the shift in the focus of the comic. Celestial Betty tries to convince Alec that this comic, his wife, and all the exploits he's written about are not the reality he lives in, but one that he dreams up and chooses to believe. He's confused for a bit, but eventually warps back into his reality, though it's not the way that he remembered. Upon waking up, he finds that not only is he no longer married to Betty Boop, but that he never was, and his arguments to the contrary are met with doubt from everyone he talks to. This, combined with some psychological horror involving Sonic, the one, if you remember, who shot him, leads to a mental break where Alec insists that he's married to Betty Boop. It's soon revealed that this reality was all a test designed by Celestial Betty that Alec passed due to his unwavering loyalty to his wife. He is consumed by CB and gestates in her womb before awakening from his year-long coma. One of the few things he does upon waking up is free Sonic from jail, and we get a little peek at a yet unnamed woman with a fourth wall break. So I think another pretty interesting topic or theme raised within the comic is that of the objective versus subjective reality. Now, objective reality is generally described as any universal truths that exist outside of a subject's perception or conscious awareness. Subjective reality, then, is the reality that is dependent upon the mind and how we experience the world around us. And I think a majority of people today would describe the reality of our world as a subjective one that we can all, to some extent, agree on the validity of. Though, that said, we each paradoxically live out our own subjective realities in the overall objective reality, even though our subjective experiences prevent us from fully knowing objectivity. I say all of this to lead into the way that Mr. Boop explores the blurring of this reality between it and fantasy and the over-reliance on the personal subjective world to the exclusion of other people's lived realities. I think during the first few pages of Volume 2 that you really do take Celestial Betty's wake-up call for in-universe Alec to come back to our reality at face value. I think it reflects how much we as a society have agreed upon this particular reality and insisted upon others regardless of how that affects their inner happiness or delusions. I can also see Celestial Betty as symbolic of some subconscious awareness within comic Alec that both acknowledges the fantasy of the comic world and has internalized the societal idea of objective reality that it puts a seed of doubt into the inner world that he's constructed. But his desire to remain in a world completely tethered to his mind and random whims wins out. Here, at least, and he's able to repress the valid concerns raised by his subconscious into a minor speed bump that briefly disrupted the delusion. Though the peak of the metafiction at the end of Volume 2 suggests that this reality may get tested further, so let's move on to Volume 3. Volume 3 opens with Alec showing the process of how he makes the comic, which is another aside to the audience and the sort of metafiction at play, and then the story properly starts with the introduction of a new antagonist to the volume, Mr. Boop? Well, Betty's dad, Mr. Boop, not Alec Boop, Mr. Boop. We'll just call him Betty's dad moving forward. So, following decreasing merchandising sales, Betty Boop's dad gets the idea from his assistant to start using Betty Boop's image once more to revive profits. To that end, he promptly sends a cease and desist letter to the couple, and in a weird overextension of copyright law, it effectively renders their marriage null and void, as Betty is technically considered his intellectual property. It should also be mentioned that Betty's dad was against the marriage in the first place, so appeals to reason or Betty's emotional well-being don't work here. As expected, the former couple is completely unhappy with this arrangement. Alec, then, fed up with the situation, decides to propose to Betty once more, but is caught in the act by Betty's dad. Her dad sees this as the last straw and decides to sue Alec and effectively shut down the in-universe Mr. Boop comic. This in turn leaves multiple threads in the comic unresolved as the final frames of each strip are replaced with a black square. At the end of the in-universe Mr. Boop, it shows Alec giving a tearful goodbye as he finishes off the last Mr. Boop strip. This then zooms out to show Mr. Boop, aka Alec Robbins, as in the creator of the comic, as the real Alec Robbins addresses the audience to admit that his marriage to Betty Boop was a lie. A complete sham, he was a total fraudster. We then get another tease at this mysterious woman as we learn that she finds Alec attractive and becomes more interested in the comic. So, let's talk a little bit about US copyright law. Fun! So, copyright law or intellectual property is something that I'm not entirely well-versed in a strictly legal standpoint, so don't take anything I say legally, at least, with more than like a grain of salt. But the gist of how it works is that, in the US at least, the law prohibits the unauthorized copying of a work of authorship. Copyright law itself is an extension of intellectual property, and why this matters both to and outside of the comic is that it sets the parameters to which people or fans can engage with the work. If a work is found to use or distribute a copyrighted work without the express permission given by the copyright holder, then that holder can invoke legal action and can penalize the redistributor. And in the case of Mr. Boop, it is allowed to exist and be profited off of because it exists as a parody of each character or work presented in the comics. So it just barely scrapes by under the fair use label. And while copywriting a work is known to have its benefits, like protection against works that infringe upon your IP, there are arguments against the current state of copyright law or even copyright as a concept, with the more extreme version of copyright critique generally known as copyright abolition. Arguments for copyright abolition include the creation of an artificial scarcity of ideas and intellectual monopolization. And while I do like the protection that the concept of intellectual property inherently gives to independent creators, I can also see the perspective from the abolitionist mindset, especially with the IP monopolization bit. Like, think about the countless Disney remakes, reboots, and revivals. Though these don't do anything to extend the copyright of earlier films, well, at least not yet. We'll see how that plays out when Steamboat Willie is out in the public domain. They still heavily market themselves in the current exclusivity of holding the copyright of their older work, as well as a way to push that anything made by the Disney brand is the definitive version of a particular work. So, all that said, I can see how the comic Mr. Boop sways more towards the line of the copyright abolitionist stance, and it's interesting to read it through that lens. And everything from really pushing the boundaries of its parody status, to including characters from very litigious companies participating in very edgy behaviors, to the cartoonishly evil representation of copyright infringement, cease and desist threats, etc., through Betty's dad, supports this reading. And speaking of reading, let's get through this fourth and final volume. The fourth and final volume of Mr. Boop starts with Alec Robbins, again the Mr. Boop reference, if you notice in the changing title of the comic, now deciding to keep the comic going by documenting what his actual life is like, without any lies or jokes or even she who shall not be named. He has a normal day at the supermarket until he bumps into a young woman, the one previously teased in earlier volumes if you remember, and they strike up a conversation where she recognizes him as the Mr. Boop guy. We soon learn that her name is Elizabeth, but that she goes by Liz, though the name Elizabeth kind of reminds me of someone. Anyway, the relationship between Alec and Liz soon develops into a romance, and it seems to be going well until it doesn't. Strange things happen in the story, like Liz confronting Alec about the way he frames her compliments to be over-complimentary, or the way she's drawn to resemble Betty Boop more in later pages. This then develops into Liz adopting a more Betty Boop-like appearance, and she even changes her name from Liz to Betty. New Betty ends up marrying Alec and changes her name to Boop, and then, oh, whoops, once again, Alec is married to Betty Boop, and then the comic reverts back to the style of Volume 1. Only things have gotten a little different. New Betty seems more nervous and less genuinely happy here than the one that appeared in Volume 1. And I mean, even before the wedding, New Betty suggested that Alec was living in a fantasy before being forced by the conventions of the comic to amend that statement into something that Alec would want to hear. And it's then you realize that, like Bug says, something screwy is going on here. Or at least screwier than usual. But speaking of Bugs, it seems like he's gained some sort of awareness of the situation he's in. It's like something isn't right and he's not where he's meant to be, and he eventually confronts Alec at gunpoint about this. Alec refuses to admit that anything's wrong though, and this prompts Bugs to point the weapon towards himself. But right as Bugs is about to pull the trigger to escape this comic, Betty bursts in and tells Alec the world of this comic isn't real, even though he adamantly denies it. Eventually though, through tears in his eyes, Alec relinquishes control of Betty/Liz, as well as all of the other cartoon characters that he's trapped in this comic, and they're all able to return to their proper realities, and this is depicted through a montage in the video segment. The comic properly ends with Alec at the strip club, a fictional show about comic creators, and he walks out of the frame, thus ending the series. I think a lot of the themes mentioned previously, especially in regards to subjective reality, kind of fold into the overall themes of metafiction and constructed realities. And a basic definition of metafiction is a form of fiction which emphasizes its own constructedness in a way that continually reminds the audience to be aware that they are reading or viewing a fictional work. And when characters or the story directly acknowledge the audience, we typically call that breaking the fourth wall, the wall being the invisible barrier that separates the audience and the work. And Mr. Boop is just full of fourth wall breaks, to the point that I question if there even is a wall anymore, as the latter half of the series really leads into addressing the audience and the absurdity of the comic flat out multiple times. I will say though that I've sometimes found characters addressing the audience to be sort of eerie at times. Like, the awareness that your existence is purely for the entertainment of strangers has got to be a little horrifying to live with, right? Especially if your creator is someone who's kidnapped you from your universe to play pretend in a sick fantasy or reality. See, the thing about metafiction is that it's usually contained to the medium of the work itself, but here the persona of Alec Robbins or Boop extended beyond the comics into the filmed video segments, the game, and the real world. So some things that I haven't talked about yet are the video segments. There are 4 of them, but I'm mainly going to focus on the videos that take place at the strip club, or again the fictional show about comic creators, because the Drawing My Wife video is pretty much just what the title suggests. In these film segments, Alec Robbins plays Alec Robbins, or at least the exaggerated persona of the Alec that we get to know in the comic. And I think it's in these videos, as well as some in-character tweets from his account, where the line between fiction and reality get blurred. Because it's one thing to just draw yourself with Betty Boop, but another thing entirely to put a real face to all that madness. Not only that, but the ability to comment and reply on this weird space invites the audience to play. And what most of the commenters and supporters do is reinforce the validity of Alec's delusion rather than tell him to get a grip. All of us, including Tim Robinson from I Think You Should Leave, support his delusion. But like even the most compelling works of fiction, it eventually has to end, and Alec must face his reality, and the vulnerability is depicted in a frame where he's suddenly nude that he has to adjust to living without his cartoon world to protect him. So I know what you're all thinking right now. Wow, what a deeply insightful and passionate love story that all was. And while I know that most of us with high IQs would agree with that take, for others it might not read so clearly, so let me just explain. I think that at its core, Mr. Boop is a story about the love that someone like Alec Robbins has for not just Betty Boop, but the cartoons that he grew up with, and the way that they shaped him. And while he definitely shows his love in ways that are different than how most people would express this, it's still an expression of deep admiration and love all the same, even if it is buried under 100 layers of irony, because there truly is no wrong way to show your love, outside of the many, many illegal ways. And I guess another thing about love is that you've got to realize when it's time to let them go, that maybe the thing or the person that you love is just happier somewhere else, and you just have to be okay with that and move on. But, you know, I don't have to worry about that with Vash, because Vash? Oh.
What's wrong?
Oh, I had a dream where we weren't married anymore. It's a good thing I'm able to be emotionally vulnerable with my wife Betty Boop.
Aw, sweetheart. There, it's okay. I'm so lucky I've got such a sensitive husband. I'll stay with him forever.
Okay, so that was Mr. Boop. I know that this video, again, was kind of a weird one, but I've been wanting to talk about this comic since it ended, and also I just kind of wanted to challenge myself to see if there was a serious analysis that I could pull from a comic that seemed so unserious from the outset. If you still want to check out the comic for yourself, it's free to read on the Mr. Boop site or webtoon. Sometimes Alec still sells physical copies of the comics, so just be on the lookout for the next time those release. I'd also be remiss not to mention Alec Robbins' new comic, Crime Hot, which is about, in his words, an ongoing sci-fi comic about hot, goofy thieves in space. I myself have only gotten a few pages in, but I enjoy it so far, so I'll try to catch up with it the best I can. But outside of that, I think that's all I have to say about this comic on this video, but I do want to know down in the comments if you've read or are planning to read the comic, and all your thoughts and theories on it. I'd definitely be interested in talking with all of you down in the comments about that. But outside of that, feel free to follow my Twitter or Instagram. My INPRNT and Ko-fi links are down in the description, but I guess that's about it, so boop boop be doop. Hey, so I wanted to mention a few things before ending this video. The first of which is a big thank you to my friend SUMI for providing the voice of Betty Boop for this video, which is a big help because I don't think that I could have stood to listen and edit myself doing the voice. So again, it was a big help. And if you want to follow them on their socials, they're at Captain Grizzly, and I will also post the links to those places down in the description. The second thing that I wanted to mention is, and I didn't realize this until over the weekend, but today, February 28th, is the second anniversary of when Mr. Boop was first posted. And not only that, but it seems like Alec Robbins has posted a new sequel series to Mr. Boop called Mr. Group, the story of which seems to be about locking a group of his Twitter followers in a puzzle dungeon. And obviously, because it's so new, that's about all that I know, other than the fact that Betty Boop won't be making an appearance in this comic. Allegedly, we'll see. So yeah, I just thought that it'd be worth tacking on to the end of this video before I get comments that are like, oh my god, did you know that he just released, like, yes, I know. I procrastinated on editing this video and it actually just seemed to work out in my favor. So I'm ahead and I know about all that, and I'd actually be curious if, say, this comic develops more in the future regarding like themes or storylines, if you guys would also be interested in watching another video on that whenever that comes out. But yeah, so just to echo previously on what I said earlier, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will all see you on the next one, whenever that comes out.